So yeah, today's discussion will mainly be a supplementary to the ways of Android. It's not really one of the main fundamentals, so you don't necessarily need to understand Android development. But it's nice to have, and it improves quality of life greatly. Yeah. Anyways, this portion of the discussion will be about ViewBinding, and here's just the attendance code, and the number of the day is today's date, which is 16. Um, All right, cool. And then I'll give you guys a few more seconds to finish that. Um, and then I'll go to the next slide. Okay. So here is kind of like an example of what you can do after knowing what view binding is. I'll explain in a second. This is kind of like the before and after of what you can do with it. So it's kind of on the left here is like in with the out, and then on the right is like out with the old, and then on the right is in with the new. So beforehand, you kind of have to use like find view by ID and then use the IDs to get the corresponding elements, and then you can manipulate them from that. But with view binding, you can just reference all of all the views, starting from just this binding variable here. So binding, what exactly is that? So view binding is a feature that allows you to more easily write code that interacts with views. So once view binding is enabled in your project, in your module, it generates a binding class for each XML layout file present in that module. And an instance of that class contains direct references to all the views that have an ID in the corresponding layout. And in most cases, view binding replaces find view by ID. So how does it all work? So once again, if view binding is enabled for a module, a binding class is generated for each XML layout the file that the module contains, and each binding class contains references to the root view and all the views that have an ID. The name of the binding class is generated by converting the name of the XML file to kind of Pascal case and adding the word binding to the end of it. So, for example, this on the left here, we have an example layout called result profile XML. And then the resulting binding name for the class is result profile binding with capital letters in each of the nouns in the class name. So yeah, this class has two fields, a text view called name and a button called button. And since the image view here has no ID, it doesn't get a reference in the binding class. So you can't really reference it by name unless you get an ID, which is how it works regularly when you're using view by ID. You can't get the view in the first place if there's no ID. So it's very similar in that sense with how it crosses with binding. And every binding class also includes like a get root method, which provides a direct reference to the root view of the corresponding layout file and ultimately is used to tell the activity to use the layout from the binding object with set content view, as you can see here. I realize these are probably like really small, but this line right here. So an example of the root method of binding is used in the result profile binding class, and that returns the linear layout view, and that ties the binding to the main activity here and connects the two together. So very similar in that sense to how it regularly work. We have to reference which layout you're using for the activity to connect the two and make sure that the changes correspond to both. So how does this work under the hood? So here's just an example of kind of like what's auto-generated when you use ViewBinding. So beneath the hood, it's actually one Java code, because Kotlin and Java, Kotlin has backwards compatibility with Java. So Java works with Java, but doesn't work with Kotlin. But Kotlin does work on Java files. And it also uses find view by ID also in the binding method here. You might be wondering to yourself, what's the point of this kind of middleman? Well, there can be a lot of mishaps that happen with find view by ID. Right. So find view by ID is the source of many user-facing bugs in Android. It's easy to pass in an ID that's not in the current layout, and then once you're actually running your app, if you're manipulating that object somehow, you'll get a null and then you'll crash because, of course, you have a null pointer exception there. So then, since there isn't any type safety built in when you're using find view by ID, it's easy to ship code that looks like the bottom example here, where you're finding view by ID, where it expects a text view there, but you're actually passing in a ID that refers to an image. So you have a mishap there also. So what's good about ViewBinding is that it eliminates kind of both these problems and has important advantages over find view by ID. So one of them is null safety. So since ViewBinding creates direct references to views, there's no risk of having like null pointer exceptions due to an invalid view ID. Additionally, when a view is only present in some configuration of a layout, the field contains its reference in the binding class, marked as it being possibly nullable. So Kotlin knows if you're trying to reference that view, you'll have to check explicitly with like the null checks, either using like an if statement to check if it's null or using any else operators. And the second advantage over find view by ID is type safety. So the fields in each of the binding class have types matching the views that they reference in the XML file. So there's no risk of like a class cast exception with like the previous example here, where you had the find view by ID text view with the image passed in. You can't get that once you're using ViewBinding. So it's pretty cool. And these differences mean that the incompatibilities between your layout and your code, usually if you have these types of things where you have null issues or type safeties, that's the difference between your code failing at runtime versus at compile time. Because if it's at compile time, then you can check it before it actually is up and running. So the user won't ever run into any unexpected crashes, which I don't know about you, but I kind of hate running into when an app crashes on me for no reason. So we love having less crashes. Yeah. I guess I'll just showcase a little bit of kind of how this works. And yeah, I'll showcase a little bit of how this works inside of Android Studio. Give me a second to switch. Okay, the first thing I'll do is I want to try and create a new project. I'll just do that as normal. New project. I'll just do an empty activity. Actually, I believe I can't see this on my laptop. Let me switch views. Okay. All right, I'm just gonna create a new project. I'll just name it, this is week. Just name it demo view binding. All right, cool. And I'll just let that build for a second. Okay, so the first thing you have to do to actually enable ViewBinding is that you have to enable it in your Gradle file, which you can access through, I guess you still have to wait for it to finish. Oh, actually it's here, okay. In the Gradle file underneath like the app directory. Yes, the app directory. So you can enable it. Using view binding equals true, but this is surrounded by build features, which means that at build we want this to be true, and we want view to be true, which means that it'll generate for each of the layout files, it'll generate the equivalent view binding class. I'll just let that sync. Usually when you change things in Gradle, you have to wait for like the changes to actually like be incorporated into your project. Like if you're adding like a new library down here, or if you're changing something up here, you have to let it sync again, and then it should be good. So. Actually, also, let me make sure that my settings are good. Gradle. Right. Okay. Change this. Okay. I just have to wait for this to finish syncing, and then it should be good. Okay, that's all done. Let's see if we can. So right now we have this like main here, but now since view binding is enabled, we should be able to access this layout file using view binding. In our main activity here. Oh, I can see this again. Oh my gosh. I'll let that finish. Maybe I can access it now. So val binding, in this case, as I said, like the binding equivalent binding class is similar to the layout class with like, if it's activity underscore main, it'll be named activity main binding. So the type of this is activity main binding. Activity main binding equals, actually I'll just wait. Let me just wait for it to finish building. I mean finish building. Oh, is it finished? Oh my gosh. Activity main binding. Sorry, this always usually takes a minute on my computer. Okay, I guess now actually building here, as you can see. Okay. All right, and then I just auto imported it for us. So this is the class. This is the activity main binding class here. It's imported right there. So now, in order to actually tie it to our activity here, we have to inflate it. And what inflating does behind the scene, it ties each of the individual elements to this binding object so we can refer to them directly using just this class right here. And then if we were using the old way, we'd have to include this line, but now we can change it to be, instead of tying it to the layout directly, we tie it to our binding. Just like so. And now we can, I think all we have is a text view here. Okay, first we have to give this an ID. So right now, since there's no ID on any of this, we can't refer to anything within this binding class. So we have to give IDs elements in our layout file. So I'll just do that right now. In this case, I'll give this constraint layout. I'll give this an ID of text. And then I'll also define a button too. Let's do button, there we go. Do 100dB, 100dB, margin top, 10 dB. Give an ID of button, and then I'll constrain the top to the bottom of the text view. And then I'll also constrain it horizontally using left to left of parent and also right to right of parent. And that should be good. Well, let's just double check that. Oh, let me get rid of this. All right, cool. So we have our button. It's a square, which is really not a common button shape, but it's okay. Yes, our button there. Okay. Now, since we have things with IDs now we can refer to them in our actual activity here. So see, we have the 3 different things that we just defined as the names with the IDs. So in this case, we had a button with an ID of button. It gave us the button, the constraint layout, and then the text. And then we can just manipulate them as so. So if I want to change the text of the text, I can just do binding.text. And then again, let's say I want to change this to my favorite fruit, which is, what did I say last time? I think I said red grapes, right? I said a lot of things last time. I'll just go with red grapes. In this case, here's a useful thing you can do. If you have like a string, a raw string, you can easily convert it to a string in your XML. You can give it a name here. I'll just give it string red grapes. And it'll automatically have the exact syntax I need to get the string. And let's say on the button click, I want to change text to another favorite fruit of mine. Binding button set on click listener. Bada bing, bada boom. Let's change this text to, gosh, kiwi. Even though I'm allergic to kiwis, I still enjoy eating them. I have to keep my EpiPen near me when I try them, but it's worth the sacrifice, I think. So, cool. I'm not gonna run this because I know it's gonna take a long time to do so. So I'll just pretend, well, yeah, I know this works for sure. It's pretty simple. Shouldn't be any bugs. But yeah, it's kind of the power you can do with binding. Really simple, really easy to implement. There's little to no overhead, kind of. And before, if I wanted to try and do this the old way, I would have to do like content view, our layout, what was it? Activity main, and then val button equals find view by ID r.id dot. See, it's already like really wordy. I guess it's already really wordy. Button. Oh gosh. And then I also have to add in the text, and then it's just not a fun time. View. Anyways, you get the idea, right? I have to define these two things, and then I can work on them as set on click listener, and then text dot text equals whatever. But binding allows us to do kind of all at once without having to go through all of these steps. It'll make sure that these things are solid in the sense that, you know, if it's null, it will check for that. And if it's the right ID, it makes sure that those things are aligned correctly. So yeah, it's pretty nice in that sense. Yeah. Okay. I think next Jesse wanted to go over the homework as well, because I think homework 3 is dependent on homework 2. So we'll probably go over that really briefly before everything. So I'm going to get homework 2 pulled up. I'll kind of explain kind of like the run through of how things work. Yeah. So give me a second to pull up homework 2. I don't know if I already have it. File open, recent. Oh, there's a lot of projects here. Okay, give me a second. Okay, let me just solve a